Hello. Today we're going to be taking a look at 10 more games on my M5 iPad Pro. So let's get to it. Up first, we have Grid Legends from Feral Interactive. The studio recently updated this AAA racer to take full advantage of the new M5 iPad Pro, and the results are impressive. The graphics preset now runs at 60 FPS, making this the only Apple mobile device to reach that frame rate in this mode. Most other devices target 30 FPS for this preset. The game runs at 1645 by 1134 and uses dynamic resolution scaling with contrast adaptive sharpening to keep performance smooth and also visuals. Visually, it looks fantastic, and the resolution doesn't dip nearly as low with DRS compared to performance mode. The M5 holds 60 FPS very consistently, even with fireworks and confetti effects enabled. The only track I noticed issues was the Akutama Sprint track, which can drop down to around 50. Switching to performance mode instantly locks it at a steady 60 FPS on this track. Compared to the M4 iPad Pro, which is capped at 40 FPS in graphics mode, this is a major improvement. That bump in performance likely comes from the M5's lower GPU frame time, which is now under 16 ms, while the M4 typically exceeds 20 ms. Since 60 FPS isn't possible on M4, Feral wisely capped it at 40 FPS instead. It's still a smart balance. 40 FPS feels much smoother and more responsive than, say, 30. Moving on, we have Resident Evil 2 from Capcom. The M3, M4, and M5 iPads feature an exclusive preset for RE2 called High Quality. This preset targets higher graphical settings, uses over 4 GB of RAM, and supports up to 60 FPS. It's not full max settings, but rather a mix of high and medium options, but it still looks pretty good. I tested this mode on my M5 iPad Pro at 1920 by 1324 resolution with metal effects disabled. And while it doesn't quite reach a locked 60 FPS, it hovers closer to 40 to 50, I still think it's pretty impressive for a tablet. To achieve 60 FPS here, using the high quality preset, there are two viable options. Either drop the resolution to 1600 by 1102, or keep it at 1920 by 1324 and enable metal effects quality. Personally, I prefer playing with metal effects off, even if we're running at a lower resolution. Both metal effects quality and performance modes render at 50% of your target resolution, which introduces noticeable ghosting, especially in the performance setting, which uses spatial upscaling. When comparing the M5 to the M4 iPad Pro, both running at the same settings, the uplift is modest here, usually around 5 FPS more. Sometimes it's even identical. I tested this scene multiple times to confirm accuracy, and I used minimal on-screen metal HUD elements, and I also tested this without recording, and it's always the same results. In a way, it's encouraging to see just how capable the M4 iPad Pro still is. Up next is another Resident Evil title, RE7. This iPad port stands out for a few reasons. First, it doesn't take full advantage of the display's real estate. Instead, it runs in a 16:9 aspect ratio within a 4:3 screen, leaving black bars at the top and bottom. It's a little annoying. The preset options here are also quite peculiar. The prioritized performance preset is heavily tied to Metal Effects temporal upscaling, and you can't disable it. For example, when targeting maximum resolution in this preset, the game does hold 60 FPS with no problem. But if you check the numbers in the Metal HUD, Metal Effects scales the input resolution down to 1008 by 568 and then upscales it to 2016 by 1136. I actually don't think the device could handle much higher rendering settings, as the GPU frame time sits very close to 16 milliseconds in this state. Although if you lower the resolution, the GPU frame time obviously drops. Still, I hope Capcom allows us to disable Metal Effects in a future update here, particularly when running at lower resolutions. The graphics preset behaves differently. It doesn't use Metal Effects at all, but instead applies a 0.9 or 90% internal resolution scale. So, while we're rendering at the maximum resolution here, it's effectively upscaling from around 2178 by 1501, which is still quite high. This preset is capped at 30 FPS too, and since GPU frame time exceeds 20 ms, pushing for 60 frames wouldn't be feasible at this resolution. Likely lowering it would be fine. At 30 FPS, the game remains stable with no major dips, though to be fair, Resident Evil 7 is not a demanding game anymore. Lastly, the balanced preset has some very big issues right now. It uses the same Metal Effects scaling numbers, but it should be pushing for 40 FPS here. However, there seems to be a refresh rate bug. The frame rate consistently jumps between 30 and 40, even at low resolutions. I tested this on both M4 and M5 iPad Pro, and they both have identical results. While my older M1 iPad Pro held a stable 40 FPS. It's a bizarre issue, and hopefully one Capcom will patch soon. Our last Resident Evil game to look at is Village. Compared to all the other ports, this one is much closer to PC in terms of its in-game graphical settings and offer. I first tried the game at 1920 by 1324 and balanced preset. This is with Metal Effects disabled too. What we're seeing here is around 60 FPS, sometimes higher, which I think is absolutely awesome, especially given that we're not using Metal Effects. Even during big explosions, it doesn't go much below 60. For the best experience, I would definitely recommend enabling a 60 FPS cap though, but really, I think this is freaking awesome. But can the M5 iPad Pro reach 120 FPS for this title? Not really, at least not at respectable resolutions. For example, this is 1600 by 1102, prioritized performance preset and with Metal Effects on quality. This means, yes, we can get up to like 100 FPS, but we're actually running at a super low resolution with Metal Effects. 376p. I'll say that again. 376p. It's really low. During very challenging scenes, the frame rate does go down to like 80. It goes without saying. This iPad Pro, or any iPad Pro, is not capable of pulling off 120 frames for modern AAA games. And it would be misleading of me to say it does, and it would be misleading of anyone else to say that it does as well. I also wanted to test this game at max graphics, mainly to see if we could get over 8 gig of RAM being used. But no, I could not get it to go much over 7. In fact, I have not seen any game on iPad use over 8 gig of RAM yet. The metal HUD shows us that we have about 10 gig of available memory, which means that the swappable memory is working fine here. Yippee! We basically just need to see a more demanding game in the future. Like, I don't know, maybe Cyberpunk, Apple, please? Overall, the M5 GPU delivers around 17 to 18% lower frame times in RE Village at the same settings. That roughly translates to a similar 15 to 20% uplift in frame rate, about 10 to 15 more frames per second in most scenes. Excellent. Here we have Sniper Elite 4. I think on iPads with an M2 or newer chip, as well as the iPhone 15 Pro, 16 Pro, and 17 Pro, the game supports 60 FPS. That said, only the M4 and M5 iPad Pro can actually maintain a locked 60 here, thanks to their GPU frame time staying below 16 milliseconds. The game doesn't offer any other graphical options, unfortunately. By default, Sniper Elite 4 runs at mostly high settings on mobile. Rebellion have opted for Metal Effects spatial upscaling, which isn't actually a bad choice here, since the internal resolution is fairly high, with a scaling input of 1400 by 990 and a scaling target of 1920 by 1320. While I'd personally prefer temporal upscaling here for a cleaner image, the overall image quality actually still looks pretty good. Performance-wise, the M5 delivers the same experience as the M4 iPad Pro, with no noticeable drops. There are some strange micro stutters for the 60 FPS target, although I don't think you'll notice this if you don't have the Metal HUD enabled. This is probably one of the most optimized AAA ports on mobile, though it is worth remembering that the game is really old. It's from 2017, so it's not really that demanding anymore. Still, I'd love to see Rebellion maybe add like a 90 or even a 120 FPS toggle for the M5 iPad Pro in a future update. I think this game would be awesome at like 120. It probably would require frame times closer to 8 ms to be pulling off 120, which means we'll probably need to be running the game at a lower resolution if Rebellion allowed that. Maybe if they had like a 90 or 120 FPS toggle and you went and you enabled it, the game automatically lowered the resolution. I don't know, that could be an option. Moving on, we have Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. I believe the game runs at 1920 by 1080 on M series iPads, then upscales that to the device's native resolution. It also uses a 16 by 9 aspect ratio, meaning you'll see black bars at the top and bottom of the display. Unlike the Mac version, The Lost Crown on iPad Pro supports full 120Hz gameplay, which is weird because on Mac it's still capped at 60 FPS, despite Ubisoft previously saying they would update this. What are you doing, people? Update the game on Mac. There is no reason why there needs to be a 60 FPS cap there. It's baffling. Still, I wanted to highlight this game because it's a really good example of the type of games that benefit from 120 FPS on iPad Pros. The Lost Crown, while technically a AAA release, because it's from Ubisoft, it isn't actually that demanding. So it makes maintaining 120 FPS really easy for any iPad. Unlike on iPhones with a 120Hz display, the 120 FPS toggle for Subnautica works on iPad Pros. The game also only lets you enable a high landscape detail and raise up the resolution. Overall, the game is running at low graphics compared to PC and console, but I think this is perfectly fine. Anyway, if you play at absurdly high resolution, which is the max you can go, the iPad quickly throttles and the FPS tanks. I found to actually get 120 FPS on average, I need to lower the resolution to high. Unfortunately, PlayDigis could not tell me the scaling percentages of the resolution options, but I'd say at high, it's maybe like 600p, but that's a guess. The biggest issue, even at this lower resolution, is that there are some scenes that make the FPS drop quite a bit, such as the kelp forest in particular. To be honest, I don't think 120 FPS for this type of game is all that important. If you aim for 60 FPS, you can play at very high resolution more comfortably, and the game looks quite a bit better. One thing I couldn't really fix here was the micro stuttering. Even at 60 FPS, the frame interval shows 16 milliseconds, but it's jumping between different numbers like I don't know, 16.67, then 16.74, then 16.63, and so on. That being said, I'm not confident that you'll even notice this with the metal HUD disabled. Overall, this game runs pretty well. HITMAN Absolution by Feral Interactive. Due to its age, originally released in 2012, it should be no surprise the game runs well here. I like how Feral Interactive let you manually change the FPS for different presets here. For example, this is graphics preset, but I've also enabled a 120Hz cap. The game also contains a benchmark mode, which is really cool. Although using this can be a little misleading at times, especially if you use it initially, as it can report very good results, but this doesn't take into account throttling. So we're seeing 100 FPS here on average. This is cool, but keep in mind, even for a really old game like this, playing at 120 FPS does make the iPad get really hot. Some scenes with lots of NPCs can struggle going below 100 FPS. So for example, after 30 minutes of playtime and retrying the benchmark mode has dropped down to 83. These Hitman games are pretty forgiving at low frame rates, so I think this is totally fine. And if you enable a 60 FPS cap, you'll have no problems. Here is Alien Isolation. Yes, another Feral game. Performance preset enables 60 FPS and lowers the resolution to 1815 by 1251. Isolation on iPhone and iPad does not use DRS, so this is native 1251p. I'm testing one of the most demanding scenes in the game, which is Mission 14, in the nest or the farm. One thing to note is that GPU frame time is remarkably low here. Incredibly low, typically around 5 ms. This, to me, is a clear indication that Feral could raise up the video settings for this preset. That being said, do they actually need to? The game looks totally fine right now, in its current state. I personally don't think it's worth Feral's time, and I think they would likely agree with me. Perhaps Feral could look into adding, a Performance Plus mode that enables 120 FPS on the latest iPad Pros. I think it's more than possible here now. One thing to note is that right now, the graphics preset is running the game at 30 FPS. This should be 40 FPS on M5 iPad Pro, given that all iPad Pros, I think back to the A12X, run the game at 40 FPS for this preset. I take it Feral just need to put out a quick update for the hardware. It would be cool as well if Feral added, 60 FPS support for this preset, given that GPU time is below 16 milliseconds in this state too. All right, so our last game to look at is Way of the Hunter, Wild America, and this one is by Handy Games. On the M5 iPad Pro, the game runs at a final output resolution of 1815 by 1251. However, the game also includes in-game resolution scaling options. Handy Games told me that Ultra targets 100% resolution, so no additional scaling. And I've put on screen what the other scaling options correspond to. So basically, whatever resolution you choose in game, that will then affect the final output resolution that we see in the Metal HUD. This game can't maintain 120 FPS comfortably at max graphics and at native 1251p. That's not particularly disappointing for me though, because for this type of game, even at 60 or 30 FPS, the game is perfectly playable. So enabling a 60 FPS cap provides a much better experience, and I would recommend it. Frame pacing though isn't perfect. Sometimes there are these micro stutters, and a part of that is because of shader compilation, and other times it's just, I don't know, it's just because this port is mixed in areas. But this is a better option than pushing for 120. So if I wanted to actually reach 120 FPS, which I don't actually recommend, I had to drop the graphics quality to medium and then the resolution scale to low, which targets 50% of the resolution shown in the Metal HUD. So we're running at roughly 908 by 626, so pretty low. I don't recommend playing the game like this. Overall, this is one of Handy Games' weaker ports. That being said, this is a pretty demanding game. There are some pretty glaring issues though, such as major pop-in with trees, and foliage and water quality is noticeably low. It's still arguably the best sniper hunting game available on mobile, so I do think it's worth checking out if you like these type of games. Compared to my M4 iPad Pro at the same settings, performance here is about 5 to 8 FPS higher, and the GPU is around 20% faster on average, which lines up with what we've seen in other games too. Alrighty everyone, so that was gaming on the M5 iPad Pro again. This is my second video covering this topic, and I said basically what I want to say in the first video, but I also want to add on with this one that while this thing is very capable, and so is this is the M4 iPad Pro. Both are very capable, and if you own the M4 iPad Pro, I don't see any reason to upgrade. Both are very good. Both are fantastic for playing games, but they also suck because, as I keep saying over and over again, and I said this with the iPhone, there is just not enough proper games that I would consider proper games. Like a lot of people, when I make these videos, they say, what is happening here? They say, oh, can you test PUBG and Genshin Impact and COD Mobile? I don't want to show games like that. I want to see bigger games like what I've shown here. And I want to see more that aren't available here. Like I put on screen a few games that I would like to see on mobile. And I think all of these games would be wonderful, and they would have a very positive impact on the state of mobile gaming if they arrive. That's my only gripe. The power is here, but there's no games to show for it. I really, really, really want not just Apple to work on this, but just also the general public just having a different perspective on gaming on here. I want better games. I want better games that I see on PC and console and Steam Deck and Switch. I want those games here too. I just want to have more fun on here instead of playing the same games every year. I want more, and it makes me so sad.